In the passage that we just read together, Acts chapter 12, what we see there is we see the viciousness of the world, and then we see God's sovereignty displayed in two different ways, and then we see the comeuppance of the world. And I expect you can see with those headings that I am using Herod as typifying the world. And so I expect it would be useful for us to know something about this Herod. He's introduced to us here as Herod the king. And now there are a number of Herods in the Bible and a number more that don't appear in the Bible. Herod was a family name. They all took the name from Herod the Great. He was the one that we learn of in the Christmas story. Now, this particular Herod, the one in Acts chapter 12, he was Herod Agrippa, and he was the grandson of Herod the Great. This Herod, he lived from 9 BC to AD 44. This means that Herod Agrippa here, then he died about 15 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And it seems that this particular Herod, he was in and out of trouble with the Roman emperors. But once Caligula became emperor, everything changed for him. Caligula was the one who gave him the title of king, and his territory at that point was northeast of Israel. But Caligula later gave him Galilee and Perea. And then when Claudius became emperor, he gave him, on top of that, Judea and Samaria. So this King Herod, he was governor of Judea from AD 41 to AD 44. Now that's just background information for you, but it is useful. It's useful to know because it reminds us that the Bible deals with real people in real historic settings. Now, there are many who dismiss the Bible as nothing more than fairy stories. But the vast majority of the Bible is history. And in terms of documentary evidence, it's very well attested history. It is much better than many other historical documents that of antiquity that many people are quite happy to accept. It's as if having these documents bound together in this binding, it's as if that somehow makes them irrelevant. It's as if it nullifies what they actually say. But don't be fooled, and don't let anyone fool you. Christianity is known as a historic religion because it deals with the real world, the world that we know. That's where it's set. Now, it does tell us more, tells us more than that. But what it doesn't do is it does not invite us into a world where the truth is all bendy and flexible, as if you can make it mean anything you like. Some people deal with it like that, but that is not what it does. So then, this Herod the king, this particular one in Acts chapter 12, he gives us a picture of what the world is like. Now I say that because he's clearly opposed to the church. And that's not an arbitrary division that I've made up, the world and the church. And in 1 John 2 verse 15 we're told, if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So there's a division. James 4 and verse 4 says, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Again, you see the stark division. And then, of course, there's our motto text from Romans 12 and verse 2, which says, and be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. there is a very sharp division between the world and the church. Now, I'm sure that we are all very thankful that we do not always feel the full force of that division. We are thankful that we live in a place and a time where there are some restraints on those who would seek to harm the church. But Herod the king here, he gives us an idea of what the world is like when the gloves are off, as we might say. And of course it does rather look like the gloves are coming off more and more in our generation. Well, we are told here that Herod stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. To vex means to maltreat or to afflict. That is, he was harming the church. Now, exactly what he did to those ones, we're not told, but it wouldn't have been pleasant. It would have been quite hurtful and harmful. What it reminds me of what is going on in the United Kingdom these days, where street preachers and even people who are praying silently in their heads get arrested, and then they're released without charge or are found not guilty in court. You know, the process is the punishment, and that is nothing other than state intimidation. Well, that is what Herod the king was doing, although I suspect he was being physically more brutal. Now let's just pause there for a moment. The Herod dynasty, their connection to the Jews was tenuous at best. The Herod family, they were Idumean. And that means their origins were in another country, the country of Edom. But they had adopted, at least outwardly, the Jewish religion. And of course, it's easier to rule over a people that are happy with you than those that would always be seeking to rebel against you. So keeping the Jews on side was beneficial. But remember, of course, the church in Jerusalem was mostly made up and was by far and away predominantly Jewish. So why would Herod side with the unbelieving Jews rather than the believing Jews? Well, the ultimate answer to that is, of course, because his heart was on the side of the unbelieving Jews. That is the natural condition of all mankind, of all humans. But what might have been a more immediate cause of him siding with the unbelieving Jews was that through the persecution that followed after the stoning of Stephen, he may have believed that the unbelieving Jews had the upper hand. And of course they did still hold sway in the synagogues. Whatever the case, subsequent events show us that he was simply trying to appease the masses. And that is one of the problems we face today. So many of our politicians likewise want to appease the masses. And that, of course, is what we could call the soft underbelly of democracy. Now, to be clear, I am not decrying democracy. It is probably the safest form of government that there is. But that said, it is not difficult in a democracy for politicians to sink to a kind of popularity contest. That is so easily happen. And it can make it difficult for rulers to make the right decision if the right decision is unpopular. So it was then that Herod, he started making life difficult for the church in Jerusalem. And having met little resistance, he ups the stakes. the certain persons of verse 1, they're no longer enough. Time to go after the leaders. And so he has James executed. As we are told, this was James the Apostle, the brother of John. Now, we don't know why he picked on James. We do know that the apostles went to and fro from Jerusalem to support other churches elsewhere, and presumably then to plant new churches. So it's quite possible that at that point in time, James was the only apostle in town. And as we see, what he did went down well with the Jews. Presumably that's the Jewish council. Now, in light of that, in light of how well it went down, Herod seeks to ingratiate himself more with them, and so he arrests Peter. Now, I want to come back to James in a moment and consider James and Peter together to give us one view of the sovereignty of God. But looking at this in its overall context, it's likely then that Peter had just come back from Caesarea, and we are told that it was the time of unleavened bread. So that would have been immediately after the Passover. It's interesting that in verse 4, our translators have used the word Easter. And that looks very much like interference from King James. Our translation is called the King James Bible because he instructed certain rules about what they could and could not put in there. And that looks like him. Because the Greek most certainly is not Easter. And Christians at that point in time wouldn't have even heard of the word Easter. As I say, it was the time of Passover and the week of unleavened bread. Well, Herod, he appears then to want to give some appearance of justice to his actions. So until the feast period is over, Peter is held in prison. And if you look at the description of the prison there in verse 10, there is a very high probability that this prison was in Herod's palace. We would perhaps recognise it more as a dungeon. And it was, of course, heavily guarded. In verse 4 it mentions 4 quaternions. A quaternion was 4 soldiers. So 4 quaternions would be 16 soldiers. It's possible that they were on 4 shifts, to know, but that's how many there were. And then on top of that, Peter was chained up to 2 soldiers inside his cell. It looks like Herod didn't want a repeat of that time we read of in, I think it was chapter 5, wasn't it? Yes, it was. Chapter 5, when all 12 were locked up, all 12 apostles were locked up, and they all got out. Well, he wasn't having that again, or so he thought. And while Peter is in prison, the church are praying for him. After the death of James, they must have known what Herod meant to do. That he meant to do the same thing to Peter. So what happened? What happened? Well, the night before Peter was due to be brought out and for execution, he was visited by an angel. The angel tells him, wakes him up and tells him, "Get dressed, we're leaving." Peter's chains fell off. My chains fell off. When we sing that, we remember our conversion. But anyway, Peter's chains literally fell off in prison. And we're told they passed the first and second ward. Now that would have been where guards were posted. So what this looks like is that Peter was in a cell, a dungeon, as I say, within a block of cells. So probably 2 doors have already opened and closed behind them without bothering the guards. And then came the great gate that led out to freedom, and that definitely, of course, opened to them. Now, all the while this is going on, Peter cannot believe what is happening. He thought he was having a vision of some kind. It's only when he is free and the angel has left him that he recognises that what has happened to him was real. It really had happened. Now, the whole episode is supernatural, obviously. It is the direct intervention of God in the affairs of Peter. God has determined to miraculously save Peter from death. And yet James was allowed to die. What was the difference between the two of them? They were both apostles, and they were both in what we sometimes call the inner circle of the apostles. You know how there were occasions, like in the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus only took 3 disciples with him. They were John and his brother James and Peter. So Peter and the now deceased James, they were 2 of that inner circle. And so you can see, in themselves, there was no difference. And yet one, the Lord makes the first apostolic martyr at the hands of a wicked, self-serving tyrant, and the other he wonderfully saves from the jaws of death. This is nothing other than the sovereignty of God visibly at work. And the point that this account makes is that we do not always understand the sovereignty of God. We don't always understand it, but as Jesus taught us about prayer, we should always pray, "Thy will be done." We should always have a very submissive disposition. The very point of God's sovereignty is that God is sovereign. The old Puritans, they used to refer to God as most free. Now that's just a simple recognition that there is nobody and nothing more free than God. There are absolutely no external restraints on God. It is only who God is that prevents him from doing certain things. So if we refuse to grasp that, then we cannot know the true God, the God who exists, because that's who he is. In Psalm 115 and verse 3 it says, "But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever he hath pleased." And that is exactly what is on display in the death of James, but the saving of Peter. If we seek to rob God of his sovereignty, then we are left with an impotent being or an empty word. Well, remember now that prayer was being made for Peter while he was in prison. And there was then a prayer meeting going on that night in the house of a woman called Mary. She was the mother of John Mark. Once Peter realises that he is actually truly free, it is to that woman's house that he goes. And he arrives there and he knocks on the door. Well, I don't know what the people inside thought. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, given all that has been happening, if they thought that Herod's men had come for some of them. You know, perhaps that's why they sent a little girl to answer the door, in the hope that Herod's men wouldn't be interested in a child. And while they see the little child, they might be able to run away out the back door or something like that. I don't know. Whatever the case, this girl named Rhoda, went to the door where she must have called out something like, "Who's there?" And when Peter answered her, she recognised his voice. And in her joy, she forgets to unlock the door and races back inside to tell them, "It's Peter. Your prayers have been answered." She tells them, in effect, he's here. And so now it's their turn not to believe what's going on. They tell her she's mad. Well, that's nice, isn't it? It can't possibly be Peter. Yet she, young as she is, she stands her ground and insists that it is who she says it is. And then their next comment, that it must be his angel, sounds weirder than their original unbelief. Why would they say anything like that? But it's hard to say for sure why they would. I have read various ideas as to what they were thinking, but none of them sounded particularly convincing to me. So if we just stick with the bare account, we can say that they were willing to entertain any idea except that their prayers had been answered. Now, that's a thing, isn't it? They did not believe that their prayers had been answered. If they did not believe that their prayers had been answered, they must have believed that their prayers could not be answered. And so we might say, well, they should not have been answered. You know, in James 1, verses 6 and 7, there we read, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. He that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. But let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. Anyone that asks something of the Lord should not waver. That is, they should not doubt. If they do doubt, they should not think that they will receive anything of the Lord. That is what I mean when I say their prayers ought not to have been answered. And it's evident, you know, that when they had and they didn't believe it, well, they couldn't have been asking with faith, could they? But this is where the sovereignty of God becomes a real comfort. And that's because God's sovereignty has precedence over our weaknesses. It is good to know that things do not ultimately rely on us and our endeavours or the strength of our faith. We cannot achieve what God can achieve with the force of our own strength. But neither can we thwart God's purposes through our own weakness. Sometimes we might be tempted to despair, you know, with thoughts like, oh, it's all up to me. If I don't do this, God's will shall not be done. Now, of course, it's true that if there's a duty required of us, we should be doing it. But we can't jump from there to believing that we can spoil or frustrate God's plans. He is sovereign. That should be our strength and comfort. If it's not, then we haven't fully appreciated or fully understood what this wonderful teaching teaches us. Some people stand against this doctrine, as if it robbed them of something. And I can only imagine that they have not grasped this teaching as it is revealed to us. Well, as it transpired, and as we know, it was Peter stood there at the door of that house when it was opened. The young girl was right, and all these adults were wrong. So let that be a lesson to us, that a minority, no matter how small or apparently insignificant, can still be right. Truth is not measured by majority rule. Well, Peter then, he tells them what's happened to them, and he tells them to let James and the rest of the church know. Well, of course, one James is already dead, so this James is reckoned to be James the Lord's brother, but it could also be James the son of Alphaeus. Anyway, Peter himself, he goes elsewhere, probably to avoid being apprehended again. And when day breaks, there's total confusion in the prison. What's happened to Peter? Where's he gone? How could he possibly have escaped? And this cost his keepers their lives. It does seem that it was common policy for prison keepers to guard their prisoners on pain of death. And so it was. Herod had them put to death. And this is indicative of how the world is. The world may be at war with the church, but it is also at war with itself. The Apostle Paul says something along these lines in Titus 3 verse 3. He says, that when we were unbelievers, we were hateful and hating one another. So the church is at war with, the world is at war with the church, but it's also at war with itself. Anyway, after this event, Herod then he leaves, he goes off to Caesarea, and here we see the downfall of the world, or its comeuppance, as I have put it. It seems then that there was some falling out between the people of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon laid along the coast, not too far away, but there's some falling out between the people that lived there and Herod. Now, we're not told exactly what that was all about, but we do see that the people were greatly concerned about it, and they wanted to put matters right. So a day was set for the king to address these people, and he made sure that he had all the royal trappings for this occasion. And when he made his speech, the people of Tyre and Sidon, they saw that as their opportunity to ingratiate themselves more with him. In verse 22 we read, "And the people gave a shout, saying, 'It is the voice of God and not a man.'" Herod evidently lapped this up. The next verse states, "He gave not God the glory." Now remember, the Herods had taken on the Jewish religion. He was supposed to be a Jew. But the result of his pride was that the Lord smote him and he was eaten of worms. You see, the world is full of pride. And that's something else that John wrote about in 1 John 2 and verse 16. He said, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world." The world is all about self, perhaps more so these days than for a long time. Naturally, by ourselves, we have indeed made ourselves God. But this does not come without exceptional danger. For when we behave like that, we are seizing what is not ours. We are, as the Bible so succinctly puts it, sinners. Whatever we may feel, we are answerable to our Creator for what we have done and for what we are doing. The worst thing that we can do is try to take God's place. That is the worst thing we can do, and we have done it. We've all done it, every one of us. And we will all be punished, just like Herod was. Maybe not in the same way, but he is a picture of the fact that we will all be punished for putting ourselves in God's place. But not all of us. We won't all be punished because Jesus Christ has already borne the punishment for his people. And they, if you are one of his people, you will go from strength to strength. His people will enjoy everlasting life with their beloved Saviour in heaven. Let me just take you back just for a moment to Peter escaping from prison and the prayer meeting being held while he was there. While Peter was being led out of the prison, the bright light of the angel, he could not believe what was really happening. When Peter came to the door where the prayer meeting was happening, they likewise could not believe that their prayers had been answered. These things are hard to believe because they are so amazing. And quite often, Christians can't quite believe what has happened to them. But just as in those two examples, what has happened is true. We have been saved from our sins by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We enjoy this wonderful freedom and blessings through our faith in him. We are not different to the rest of the world in ourselves, but because Jesus Christ is our Lord, he has redeemed and rescued us. We could not imagine such a wonderful salvation in our wildest dreams. We wouldn't have thought this up. But God is able to do abundantly above all that we ask or think. So as I end this morning, I end by commending Jesus to you, by exhorting you to take hold of the life that is in him. I exhort you to turn from the selfish ways and suggestions of this world and put your faith in him. Amen.